Now let's imagine, for a moment, you join an obby game. You start playing one of the many maps that the game has to offer and you beat that map relatively quickly, but you notice that there's specifically a first-person completion time, and you're a bit interested. So you take a good few minutes to pretty much memorize the map since you barely have any visibility, and you lock in for anywhere between a few seconds to an hour to finally get a first-person completion. You're pretty proud of yourself. Until you realize you have to do that 300 more times! Speedblocks is basically your one-star platformer skill check. There are over 310 maps, each one of them fairly different, and not only are you required to do them normally, but specifically in first person. Unless you're at least terrifying skill level, expect to struggle at least a fair amount. Some of these maps are kind of nasty, especially with the limitations that forcing first person brings. That being said, what is exactly bad about playing in first person? All of these top obbies use first person quite a bit on obbies that frankly I'll never even attempt. What could possibly be so bad? Well, there's always a few limitations when it comes to forcing your camera. Firstly, you'll need to be fully confident in where you're jumping. This is usually because you won't have the visibility to see ahead of time. Secondly, shift blocking and unshift blocking is impossible, making some jumps a lot harder. Thirdly, this turns jumping between trusses from a usually rudimentary challenge to a blind leap of faith. Finally, it forces you to have good flick mechanics, something I did not have prior to this grind. But these aren't the only unique challenges this game brings to the table. Some of these maps are maze-like and not very well made, so routing and later attempting some of these obbies can get quite tiresome. Maps are given difficulties ranging from 1 to 5 stars, and frankly anywhere in between. My plan was essentially to get the hardest done with and move down the difficulty ladder. I planned on only recording the 5 stars, which I expected to be the hardest, but surprisingly the 4 stars were the hardest to get out of the way. For instance, take a look at the Forgotten Dunes. Most of these jumps are completely blind, and this took me way longer than it should have. What about Pharaoh's Temple? This map has quite a few blind trust jumps and a few other stupid monstrosities. Heaven's Demise is the least sight-readable map I've ever played and hosts a slew of horrible jumps. Seriously, this one is a stinker. But one of the worst maps by far was the Dismissed Bridge. It's incredibly dark for no real reason, it has some technical and frankly horrible blind jumps thrown in. It has whatever this is, and to top it all off, it has a first-person 2-stud climb-up. This obby is probably the hardest one in the entire game. The 5 stars, despite somehow being easier, are still no joke. While some of them are quite easy, Celestial Demaloon has this jank skip that's somehow better than the normal route, followed by this corner bottom flick and whatever this jump is. Rap God is quite the nasty lineup, followed by this super long jump, with another head hitter you must tilt into. Rap God 2 has some pretty nasty flicks and jumps, and also has some pretty nasty thin studs thrown in. Macrocosm has this particularly awful rap, followed by whatever the hell this climb up is. But the worst one, in my opinion, is the final stretch, where it's just 60 seconds of unfailable gameplay followed by a blind timing onto a truss, and a downward momentum truss jump where you blindly flick behind you to the corner of another truss. Oh, and don't you think about breathing after you've done all the 4 and 5 stars, because you just got started! Most of the 1 and 3 stars are quite varied in difficulty. Some are still as difficult as some of the 5 stars, and some are frankly jokes. The hardest 3 stars is obby called Type Space. It's genuinely one of the coolest maps in the roster, and just has an aura you just can't beat. Aura. But it has some really unforgiving raps, and is definitely one of the hardest maps in the entire game. There's this other 2-star called the Devil's Call, and it's actually just the worst obby in this game. It has this really confusing path. It has some awful blind jumps and has some jumps that just barely even work half the time. It doesn't help that this obby is super long and harder than most in the game despite its rating of 2.5 stars. In fact, most of these obbies are mixed bags. Some are really cool and others are just boring. Some are fun to play and others have these awful blind jumps. Some are really short and others are super long. After what felt like forever, the light at the end of the tunnel finally showed itself, and as soon as I knew it, I'd done the final one. That took roughly 12 hours. There's some things I'd like to talk about regarding this badge. Firstly, I think this is the platformer skill check within 1 star. If you can do the obbies required for this badge, there's a pretty high chance that with enough effort, you'll be able to do 99% of the rest of the 1-star platformers. That being said, it's definitely not the hardest thing in 1 star, so I'm going with a rating of 1.7 stars. The enjoyment is a bit more complex though. The obbies are usually not super well made. A lot of them are inoffensive, some of them are kinda cool, but the bad ones are really bad. It also doesn't help that the star ratings are completely inaccurate. Type Space should be a 5 star. and this 5-star should be a 2-star, and this 2-star should be a 4-star, this 4-star should be a 1-star, and this 4-star is the hardest thing in the game, and a lot of these maps overuse the hell out of can't collide false parts and invisible walls. Half of these obbies feel more like mazes. That being said, it's still kind of fun to turn your brain off every once in a while and knock a few of these out, and this badge is much better suited to a grind you come back to every once in a while rather than one you do all at once. Personally, it's a really complicated bottom B tier for me.